Welcome back to Plastics in Society, the only class that teaches you about plastic while showing you how to make pasta. Last time I used spaghetti as a metaphor for how polymers get entangled, but tonight I'm in the mood for fettuccine. And as it turns out, pasta is actually a great example of today's topic, extrusion. If you've ever wondered how penne or other pasta shapes are made, extrusion plays a big part in that. Shaggy dough is essentially fed through the instrument with a screw in the back that pushes the dough through a channel called the barrel. At the end of that barrel, the pasta is pushed through a cutting tool called a die. The shape of the die determines the shape of the final pasta. You can make really long strands of spaghetti or fettuccine this way, and you can even attach an automatic cutting tool for smaller pieces like penne or macaroni. The faster the cutting tool runs, the shorter the pieces will be. The material that the die is made of also matters. Pasta is usually either extruded through Teflon dies or bronze dies, which affects the final texture of the pasta. Teflon dies are totally non-stick, like a non-stick pan, so they leave a totally smooth finish on the pasta, which is ideal for filled pastas like ravioli. Bronze dies leave a much rougher surface on the pasta, which is ideal when you want your pasta to be able to soak up some sauce. This is all just an extended analogy for how plastic gets made. Extrusion is usually the first step in making any sort of plastic, as we'll get into today. Hopefully this cooking lesson gave you some insights as to what we need to consider when we are extruding plastics instead of pasta. Anyway, this needs to sit for 30 minutes to let the gluten relax. Let's get back to the studio.
All right. Extrusion is a method of making long plastic parts with a fixed cross-sectional profile. Everything as small as plastic straws or as large as PVC pipes or beams can be made just by pushing the polymer melt through the barrel of an extruder and then through a die. Even thin films, filaments, and the coatings on wires can be made with more advanced dies. Polymers are a bit more complex than pasta dough, though, mostly because of their thermal properties. The beads you see here are called nurdles, or resin. They're the actual thermoplastic polymer that gets produced during polymerization, and these are what gets fed through plastic extruders. The hopper, basically a cone-shaped feed tube, feeds the nurdles into the barrel of the extruder, which has two things going on. Like with pasta, there's a long screw that pushes the resin forward. The screw provides a shearing force, applying so much pressure that the friction between the nurdles heats them up until they become molten. The barrel usually also has heating coils around it, which help melt the polymer even more. Depending on the material being extruded, the polymer near the end of the barrel can reach nearly 5,000 psi and 300 degrees Celsius. The extruder screw typically gets increasingly tapered to ensure that everything is fully molten before it leaves the barrel. The dies are where the real magic happens. The shape of the die will determine the shape of the outlet plastic, although the profile of the plastic won't match the die entirely. Remember that polymers experience extrudet swell and can expand a lot when ejected out of a tube. That's not even considering the fact that the pressure and temperature differential between the barrel and the atmosphere is incredibly drastic. The polymer leaving the die is usually fed right into a water bath to provide cooling. When designing dies for profile extrusion, it's important not to make the walls of your part too close together, since any disruption to the extrusion line could result in a bad part. This ratio is called the tongue ratio, and high tongue ratios should be avoided. Of course, flat profiled parts aren't the only type of part you can make with extrusion. You can also make pipes and tubing, plastic sheets and thin films, and so much more. All it takes is a different die shape. For one, pipes and tubes. This die is basically a regular circle die, but with a centerpiece called a mandrel in the center, being suspended by 4 adjustment pins. Remember that the polymer is still molten as it's leaving the die, so instead of being cut into 4 pieces, the molten polymer just flows around the pins, leaving a hole in the center. This is called a spider die because if you look at it head on, the adjustment pins look like the legs of a spider. This die shape can be scaled up to make pipes the size of buildings, which is pretty incredible. Here are some clips of a larger tube being produced. This is also a good time to bring up co-extrusion. If you regularly get morning Dunkin' Donuts like a good proper New Englander, you may have noticed that the straws have 2 colors, the signature pink and orange. These straws are made by co-extrusion, which involves 2 separate extruders running in parallel and being fed into the same die. After being fed into a water tank where they cool to their final size, these straws are cut with an automated tool, just like the pasta. Look at them go. So fun. There are also dies designed to coat electrical wires in a process called overjacketing. If you've ever wondered how wires get coated in PVC, the wires are basically fed right through the die as the polymer melt is also being fed into it. The wire is made of metal, so there's no risk of it melting or corroding when exposed to molten polymer. And once everything is fed through the water bath, that polymer is stuck on the wire for good. Fibers and filaments are also made with extrusion using a spinneret die. We'll talk about this more during our lecture on stretch shaping and fast fashion. For now, just know that these strands of polyester or nylon are extruded, and they're usually spun to be much thinner and chemically treated to make them more susceptible to dyeing, as in being colored. There's also sheet extrusion, which uses something called a coat hanger die, which, funnily enough, is not a die used to make plastic coat hangers. Rather, the polymer melt is fed through this channel, which gets increasingly wider and increasingly thinner until the plastic coming out is either a rigid sheet in the case of those large acrylic sheets, or a thin film in the case of plastic wrap. When making really thin films, the plastic is usually collected up by a series of rollers, including pulling rolls, ending up in a big wind-up roll, which is what gets shipped out to whoever needs the film. If you've ever used one of those handheld stretch wrap tools for moving or something, that's how those are made. The film might also get labeled somehow during this step, all in an automated process, which is pretty cool if you're a nerd for manufacturing like me. A more common method for making thin films, though, is blown film extrusion. This doesn't use a coat hanger die, but instead uses something more like a spider die, except pointed upwards towards the sky. Once the molten polymer leaves the die, air is blown in the middle of the tube, creating a bubble that eventually cools and gets rolled into one film. Pictures don't really do it justice, so here's a video. This is high-density polyethylene, HDPE, being blown into a film, probably for grocery bags. You can see the bubble wobble a little bit here, and that's because air is being blown through at a flow rate that orients the polymer in a particular direction, either in the machine direction or the transverse direction. Remember, at the molecular level, this polymer is a wibbly mess, but depending on the application, we might want the polymer strands to be pointed all in one direction, or for the film to be isotropic, equally strong in all directions. You might see polypropylene film sold as biaxially oriented polypropylene, or BOPP, because that film should have its polymer molecules stretched equally in the machine and transverse directions. In the realm of polymer processing, it's important to get the dimensions of your final part right, and that means treating the plastic with care as it leaves the extruder. Speaking of which, for me, it's been half an hour, so let's check on my pasta.
As you can imagine, producing sheet pasta in bulk requires a lot of heavy equipment, including tracks to keep the pasta flowing straight and perhaps even pullers on the other end of the barrel. This is a delicate balance. Even here, making sheet pasta by hand, I need to not pull too hard out the other end or else the pasta thins out too much. So the pullers, my hands, are only a guide for where I want the pasta to end up, not bunched up on my countertop. I also need to make sure that this pasta and all my work surfaces are covered in flour to keep the dough workable and prevent it from breaking. And voila, 2 sheets of homemade pasta dough thinned out to about 1 millimeter thickness. I'm going to let these sit out and dry for about 15 minutes because I'm actually going to freeze them and store them for later. Let's finish the lecture.
No matter what kind of dye you're using, the polymer needs to be handled with care. We already talked about a few post-dye dimensional control measures, including cooling tanks to counteract extrude swell. Another form of dimensional control is pullers. Usually pullers are just there acting as guides, but in some cases, pullers tug on the polymer just to thin it out a bit more. When the pullers actually do apply some tensile stress, they pull them. The process is called pultrusion instead of extrusion. This method is used a lot for composite parts like fiber-reinforced plastics, since parts with high amounts of filler have a hard time getting pushed through an extruder and need the extra pulling strength to be forced through the die. Dimensional control can also happen through vacuum pressure, like in the case of bubble wrap. Basically, one film is fed through this roller, which vacuums up some of the still malleable film. Then another film is run over that to create the bubble effect. Post-processing can also alter the properties of a plastic part, like in the case of the bendy part of bendy straws. This machine takes regular straight straws, crimps them, and spits them out at a rapid pace. The last thing I want to point out here is that extrusion can also simply be used to combine polymer resin with other additives. The process of compounding usually involves taking one or more polymers as well as one or more additives and melting them in the barrel of an extruder to ultimately grind them up and ship it out in its new compounded form. This is typically what's done with PVC, for example. One company takes raw polyvinyl chloride, and then another company takes that polyvinyl chloride and compounds it with colored pigments, lubricants, plasticizers, etc., in different ratios depending on its application. Sometimes extrusion is all you need to make your part, but in other cases, it's simply the first step in making something. You'll find that many of the other polymer processing methods we'll discuss in this course start with an extruder, only to be melted again and processed in a different manner downstream. For example, the first step in injection molding, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, is melting and extruding the plastic polymer melt into a mold with a reciprocating screw that can move back and forth. Also, the blow molding of bottles can be done by blowing air through an extruded polymer while it's still somewhat molted, and then forcing it into the shape of the surrounding mold, a process we'll cover in more detail in the stretch shaping lecture. I hope you enjoyed this first lesson in polymer processing and now have a good idea what variables to look out for when extruding polymers. Or maybe you just really liked seeing how stuff gets made. Either way, let's finish up my dinner.
You know, we use a lot of plastic when we're cooking. I had to wrap the dough in plastic wrap before, and now I'm going to use this bag to freeze this fresh pasta. After I'm done with this bag, I'm going to throw it right in the trash. And That doesn't feel great. If you took this class because you're an environmentalist, one or all of the videos I just showed you probably made you pretty sick. For me, it's the video of watching straws get made that always irks me. Just something about seeing hundreds of straws spat out in a short time span. Like, it's cool to see co-extrusion in action. I'm a real nerd for manufacturing, and it's a miracle that all this technology is working in perfect coordination. But the symbol of the plastic straw as an environmental hazard has been so thoroughly burned into our minds, it's hard not to think about choking turtles or whatever. How did that happen? How did the plastic straw become such a hot topic a few years back? Was it truly a victory for the environmental movement? And what does all of this have to do with social justice?
I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Life in plastic. It's fantastic. You know, we all have a little bit of Barbie in us because of the microplastics. Welcome to my trash den. Did you know that 1 million plastic bottles are sold every minute? Did you know that we use 10 million single-use bags per minute? That's enough to wrap around the world 7 times every hour. Did you know that by 2050, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish? These facts are so horrific, they're barely comprehensible. I'm no psychologist or anything, but given that our brains are mainly wired to observe how many lions are in that bush over there, we struggle to conceive of a million of anything. So our reaction to sad plastic facts and to climate news in general isn't one of actionable optimism, but one of overwhelming grief and anxiety. Since this class is already full of very smart young people who are interested in protecting the climate, I feel like I don't need to waste any time ramping up to this. Capitalism is incompatible with sustainability. The concept of infinite economic growth in a closed system with finite resources is oxymoronic, emphasis on moronic. All climate change legislation is either destroyed or severely nerfed by big oil lobbyists. The one guy preventing a renewable energy transition owns a coal mine. I trust your intelligence, and I trust that you're paying attention. Taking on the climate crisis is going to take collective action on a scale we've never seen before. We'll get to that later in the class, but I think it's worth naming now how we feel in the face of all of this. It's all really disempowering. There's so much going on outside of our control, and that's why I try to focus so much on mental health whenever I teach courses on sustainability. It's also why I think it only makes sense that our reaction to this lack of control over the fate of the planet is to fixate on something that we can control, like our own individual consumption habits. If you Google the term single-use plastic, you'll find mentions of plastic beverage bottles, plastic bags, foam containers, coffee cups, cigarette butts, cutlery, and straws, things that we interact with every day, usually without much thought. Sometimes these infographics come with reference to how long the items take to break down in the environment. These are powerful images that overall serve a good purpose to make us reconsider our daily actions and try to live in a more sustainable manner. Before I go off on my little rant here, I just want to be perfectly clear. It is a good idea to use less plastic in your life. I have a reusable coffee mug that I take to coffee shops. I have reusable grocery bags in my car at all times, so I'm never using plastic bags. I even have a collapsible boba straw that I keep in my canvas tote at all times. You know, for boba emergencies. These are things I'm proud of and things that I think more people should do. However, I think we should also get a little more specific when we talk about which items we should try to reduce our usage of. Yes, bottles and bags and straws are single-use plastics, things that we use exactly once before throwing away, but so are medical gloves, syringes, period products, pill bottles, and other forms of medical containers, inhalers, EpiPens, surgical masks, agricultural films, and countless other objects that are vital to our daily lives. For the past few years, we've seen a lot of calls to ban single-use plastics. It's a noble goal, but many have pointed out that this label doesn't have enough specificity. Like we covered last time, plastic isn't just one thing. There are thermoplastics and thermosets. There's PET and HDPE and polypropylene and PVC and dozens of other varieties that are all chemically incompatible with one another. Most plastics have additives or exist in composites. All of this makes recycling, closing the material loop, and even just talking about plastic way more complicated. I can see why some people just want to say, screw it all, it's all bad, ban all of it. It keeps people from having to deal with the messiness of reality. And boy, are we in a mess of a reality. Waste is bad. Pollution is bad. A culture in which we treat objects as disposable without thinking about where they come from or where they end up is inherently harmful for society and the planet. So a cultural shift towards making people more mindful of their environmental impact is a good thing. But that becomes something entirely different when it gets translated into legislation, because then it's not just a question of individual action and changing culture, but one of power. The state getting a say over what kinds of plastic everyone else can use. The point people are trying to make when they say stop using single-use plastic is really more like stop using unnecessary single-use plastic and disposing of it improperly. But who gets to decide what's necessary for people to use? Aren't there some cases in which any or all of these plastics could be considered necessary, even life-saving? This brings us to, hang on, where to go? Here we go. Straws, which if you're an environmentalist online in 2018, seemed like society's biggest enemy. The Stop Sucking hashtag gained tons of popularity, including endorsements from the likes of Tom Brady and Mick Jagger, all urging companies and governments to ban plastic straws. Posts accompanied by images of turtles with straws in their noses, dead birds with plastic in their guts, or just an open sea littered, literally, with humanity's frivolous waste. The movement had some big wins, with the governments of Seattle and Washington, D.C., plus companies like Starbucks, all implementing bans on plastic straws or taking pledges to phase out plastic straws, and plenty of other brands like McDonald's, including strawless lids. And it all started with a hashtag. Let me get this trash out of the way. I know if you're not an internet person, this probably seems like I'm just digging up ancient Twitter drama, but hear me out. In the past few years, you might have gotten some dirty looks from strangers when asking for a straw for your emotional support little treat beverage. You may have even administered some of those dirty looks yourself. The environmentalist movement made straws into its #1 enemy because, to a lot of people, straws seem unnecessary. Simply lift a hot beverage in a rigid container to your working mouth with your working arms. It's that easy. And I hope it's not obtuse to say that for a lot of people, it is that easy. If you're one of those people, by all means, stop using straws. Buy a metal one or a collapsible one that fits in your bag. And most importantly, have that awkward exchange with your barista about not needing a straw. I promise that it will have an impact. However, there are a lot of reasons why some people might need a single-use polypropylene plastic straw. People with muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, or even people who are neurodivergent and like to chew on things as a stimulation method, or STIM. These people really need plastic straws and can't rely on alternatives based on metal, glass, or even the flexible, compostable options. I myself am neurodivergent and I sometimes struggle to use my metal straw. I've narrowly avoided an injury from it several times. A lesser publicized response to the Stop Sucking hashtag was the Suck-It-Ableism hashtag, where disabled people defiantly posted pictures of themselves using straws and explaining why they needed them. For one, a lot of the alternatives to plastic have an allergy risk, which can leave a lasting side effect or even kill certain kinds of people. Only glass and polypropylene are 100% hypoallergenic for all people. Then there's a risk of a choking hazard for straws that disintegrate easily, like those paper straws that fall apart in an instant. There's a high risk of injury for any straws that aren't completely rigid and inflexible, like metal or glass. Some straws aren't safe for hot liquids. The straw alternatives that aren't single-use need to be cleaned or else they can develop harmful bacteria, which are tedious to clean, especially if you're disabled. And of course, polypropylene is the cheapest to produce, which is a factor we have to consider. No matter how you look at it, polypropylene plastic straws are the best tool for the job, or at the very least, a tool that should always be made available to those who need them. With all this in mind, I think it's reasonable for businesses that sell beverages to have polypropylene drinking straws on hand. Some would even go so far as to say that these straws should be readily available without having to ask for them instead of being hidden behind a counter. This is a common issue for disabled people. Having to constantly request that your needs be met is exhausting and even embarrassing, especially in a culture that so thoroughly associates straw use with waste. Some also argue that straws should be generally unavailable at restaurants, but that you can bring one if you need one. But that also places an extra burden on people with disabilities who already have to navigate a world where they have to carry medications, mobility aids, food, batteries, and repair kits for their assistive devices, and other access tools at all times, many of which, incidentally, are also made of plastic. This whole environmental imperative around using straws has resulted in a lot of hatred being thrown onto disabled people, and not just in digital spaces. Listen to this one story. I was declined a straw at a restaurant this morning. The waitress had one in her apron. As she poured the water, I said, "Excuse me, miss, can I have a straw?" She said, "We can't just give them out," and walked away. My dad flagged her down, and when she returned to the table, I asked again, "Miss, sorry, but I really do need a straw." She then said, "We only give them to the elderly." I explained that I am disabled, that I have a degenerative joint disease in my spine, and picking up a full glass to drink causes muscle spasms under my shoulder blades. She met that with, "You seemed fine when you walked in." 5 minutes later, still no straw. Finally, I asked for a manager, and the waitress looks pissed as hell, but goes to get them. The manager heard me out, handed me a straw, then turned to the waitress and whispered, "People like that aren't worth it. Just give them the damn straw." I was so frustrated, I just started crying. My dad got up and followed the manager back to the front, where he then let her have it. He then let me handle it up to that point because I'd asked them to. And while he was shouting, people were turning to look at me. He was literally just shouting, "Her spine is deteriorating. She uses crutches most days, you moron." And I was so embarrassed. I'm still really upset. Straw ban is bullshit. It's just an excuse for ableism. A waitress should not get to decide if I'm validly disabled or not. Disabled people are so often treated as disposable or lesser than by society. In the very worst of cases, ableism can lead to downright eugenicist talking points. These people are a burden on society. Some people shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. I am by no means saying that everyone who has ever judged someone for using a plastic straw is actually a secret fascist. I'm just saying it's always worth examining our biases and reflecting on what we think a worthwhile life looks like. The idea that people who need extra resources to stay alive are a waste, or that disabled people are inherently worse off, is seriously dangerous for society. I don't know about you, but I believe all life is precious. I believe in bodily autonomy and self-determination. Just because we think our lives would be worse off if we had to use a wheelchair doesn't mean that wheelchair users aren't living full, rich lives. And surely nobody should have to give up something that they need to eat or breathe for the sake of the environment, right? Right? Is your inhaler the reason Canada can't reach its climate targets? Swap your inhalers, skip the laughing gas. How patients can help curb healthcare emissions. Metered dose inhalers like the one on the left contain high levels of hydrofluorocarbons, which act as greenhouse gases when released into the atmosphere. We're screwed. We're just screwed. Eco-Ableism is the phenomenon where disabled people are made out to be an enemy to the environmentalist movement, which is not great considering that the environmentalist movement and the disability justice movement both have worthwhile goals that need to be achieved. This is an especially damaging perspective when you consider that disabled people face worse consequences for climate change, with many activists pointing out that A, disabled people make up more than 25% of the population, and B, climate change is a mass disabling event. It's hard to flee from a sudden deadly tropical storm when you're a wheelchair user. And once we're all choking on wildfire fumes year-round, those plastic straws are going to be mighty useful. Two things can be true at once. People need to cut back on their plastic consumption, and some people need plastic in order to survive. Disabled people, broadly speaking, understand this complexity. In her article, The Rise and Fall of the Plastic Straw, which catalogs this entire drama, disability activist Alice Wong writes the following: "Plastic pollution is a problem, no doubt. Environmentalists want to engage the public and raise awareness on the need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. I believe all of this can be accomplished without steamrolling over disabled people. The entire conversation about plastic straws is about power. Who knows best? Who decides on how change is made? Who is centered in all of these activities? One example of this power is the moral reframing of plastic. The simple binaristic of plastic equals bad, compostable equals good, obscures the intimate complexity of plastic in every person's life, including mine. I cannot live without access to electricity for my ventilator or plastic in the machine's tubing and mask. Well said, Alice. I lift my straw to thee in solidarity. There's also the uncomfy reality that many of these blanket bans on single-use plastic aren't always completely effective. New York banned plastic bags 2 years ago, but due to lack of enforcement and bureaucracy, they can still be found everywhere. There is definitely cause for legislation around plastics availability, but it should be done with all people in mind. Plastic straw availability can be curtailed, with some notable exceptions written into the law to make them kinder and ADA compliant, such as having plastic straws available for those who need them, not demanding proof of disability in order to access straws, and providing straws in such a way that doesn't stigmatize or dehumanize anybody. We should acknowledge the elephant in the room here, though. Advocating for fewer plastic straw bans is essentially exactly what the plastics industry wants. In fact, here's the Society of Plastic Engineers Twitter page sharing an infographic about why disabled people need to use plastic straws, that plastics are the only option, and using the Suckit-Ableism hashtag. Yes, notorious climate justice advocate, the plastics industry, sticking up for the marginalized. Finally, the hero we need. This, oddly enough, brings us to another reason why we should shift our attention away from regulating the actions and the power of individuals. We definitely shouldn't minimize the impact of plastic straws or bags or anything else most people throw away, but because we focus so much on individual actions and not corporations, there's a much bigger pollution problem that's going completely unregulated. Remember nurdles from when this video was about extrusion like 3 hours ago? Melting down these tiny plastic pellets is the first step in any plastic production process. Well, as it turns out, pre-production nurdles are the second largest source of microplastics in the ocean, accounting for somewhere between 15 and 31% of marine plastic pollution. Over 200,000 metric tons of nurdles make their way into the oceans every year, which sometimes go on to be eaten by marine life, which makes its way up the food chain to us humans. How does all this plastic get into waterways? Usually one of two ways. First, as a direct result of the production that goes on every day. This 2018 study linked plastic spills to the transport, storage, loading, and cleaning processes that take place during manufacturing, and these spills are completely unregulated. Then there's accidental chemical spills, where pellets being transported across the ocean are dumped en masse. One disaster in 2021 saw 1,700 tons of nurdles plus thousands of tons of fuel and other pollutants dumped off the coast of Sri Lanka, and was the single biggest nurdle pollution event in the world. I don't want to hear about plastic straws ever again. In this video, I wanted to make a point about power, about who gets to make decisions about what's best for the environment. The vitriol sent to disabled people for needing straws is a great example of how environmentalist movements can seem to have good intentions, but also can have a negative impact, and perhaps even have some not so good intentions to begin with. This brings us to a much bigger conversation that Max Leberon gets to in their book, Pollution is Colonialism. This book is a non-binary indigenous scientist's perspective on environmental pollution, so you'd think it would just be an absolute takedown of current capitalist power structures. And it is. The literal opening line of the book points out that the plastics crisis was started by the plastics industry, who in the 1950s decided that the future of plastics is in the trash can, an argument that was completely capitalistic. If we can sell a product 1 billion times instead of selling it a few thousand times but recycling it each time, we'll make more money. But it also gives equal amount of heat to people who call themselves environmentalists but aren't considering all perspectives. I'm going to hold off until next video to discuss the first chapter of this book at length, but to introduce it here, Max is arguing against the idea of assimilative capacity. Assimilative capacity is the idea that there's an upper limit to what amount of pollution a given environment can handle before it stops being able to self-regulate. You can put 0.01 milligrams per liter of arsenic into your drinking water. That's fine, your body can handle it. But 0.011 milligrams per liter? Way too much. The people who came up with this idea, Earl B. Phelps and H.W. Streeter, were outspoken environmentalists, but their work ended up being used by industrial capitalists who claimed that because they were only polluting within a certain threshold, they should be free from regulation and punishment. We here at Drill Corp are committed to reducing the amount of arsenic in your drinking water to as low as 0.005 milligrams per liter by the year 2050. The idea that we can pollute just a little bit is a pretty dangerous one, and plastic makes for a great example of this. Microplastics act as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, and if you know anything about the endocrine system, I sure do, then you know that certain chemicals are harmful at literally any dose. The dose does not make the poison. In the next few lectures, we'll talk more about the threshold theory of pollution, how both plastic polluters and environmentalists assume access to land, and why all of this is connected to colonialism. See you next time, and happy learning! This is not why they call us the dolls, by the way.